Okay, so in the words of Maria Montessori, what the hand does, the mind remembers, right? So we could play rock, paper, scissors. You can remember that. Or what we could do is use your hands to draw out a surplus analysis of something like the minimum wage. Well, what's a surplus analysis, you might ask? What I mean is, let's draw a fancy diagram in economics that shows the supply and the demand for some such good or service, in this case, labor, and we'll look at the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. And it seems like a complicated diagram. And it seems like, oh my God, how do I draw this diagram? It's so complicated. Well, what you got to do is you got to literally draw it. So I'm going to help you draw out a very simple diagram, and you're going to be able to think through what it means. So without further ado, anyway, I'll stop. Okay, so let's share the screen, and I've got my, online paint program. Okay. You can use Adobe Illustrator if you want. You can use Google Docs and try drawing it out, though Google Docs is pretty tricky to use. Or you could do this by hand, right? One other option is that you literally, draw something by hand, like a cute little, lucky kitty, or a bloody demand curve. Bloody this, bloody that. You're not British. You draw something and then take a photo of it and then upload it. That's another option. But let's say you're gonna, use paint. Well, I'll show you how to do it, right? So I've got my toolbar over here, and I've got my selection tools, got my eraser, got my paint bucket, which we're gonna use in a bit. We got an eyedropper, which we won't use. We got a magnifying glass, which we probably won't use. We've got a pencil, we've got a paintbrush, we've got a spray paint can so that we can write our tag everywhere on other people's property and damage other people's property, right? And then I've got my lettering tool, and I've got a line tool and a weird kind of quasi line tool. Whoa, whoa, whoa. And I've got my shapes, okay? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my line tool and I'm going to pick kind of a heavier thickness. And I'm going to go somewhere in the middle or somewhere near the top middle of this diagram. And I'm going to pull down, and oh my goodness, I've got a pendulum swinging, and I'm going to click shift. And look at that. It's straight up and down. And now I'm going to do the same for my horizontal axis. And look at that. I've got an X and Y axis. Now I'm going to label this, and you'll know right here, right? So I've got this, with a white background and then a transparent background on this cube in the toolbar options. And what's going to happen is if I click P, right? If I write the word P for price, okay, I get all this white space that covers up the y-axis. So I don't want to do that. So I want to click this transparent button. Oh, look how nice that is, right? Be shocked how many kids have trouble with that. It's okay. Who uses paint, right? It's not 1998, okay? In Hong Kong, it's definitely not 1997. Okay, and then I've got my Q, okay? So P and Q. And I'm gonna drag over my P a little bit, and I've got my Q. I'm gonna just make it just even more perfect. Okay, I'm gonna drag the whole thing over just a tiny bit. And now I'm gonna go over here. I'm gonna pick this line again, and maybe I'll pick a medium thickness, and I'm gonna go down and set it like this, hold shift, and I get a linear demand curve. I'm not gonna do that. You know why? Because I'm gonna make sure that that line, and this is gonna be important in a bit, but I'm gonna make sure that that line hits the y-axis and that it hits the x-axis. So I should have two intercepts, so vertical intercept and horizontal intercept. And then I'm going to do the same thing with my supply curve, holding shift, get a straight line like that. And then I'm going to label it S, and I'm going to label it D. Note that I've got it set to Helvetica because Arial is stupid. And I'm not just talking about the Little Mermaid. Okay, move that over here. Voila, got a beautiful supply and demand diagram, but that's not all. I'm going to take a thinner line, and I'm going to set out an equilibrium price. Okay, like that, P star. And there's going to be a corresponding equilibrium quantity like that. I'm going to label it Q star. And I know you guys like to label it Q1. Of course, that doesn't make sense because you're going to label it Q1 and then you're going to put one on the left and one on the right, and it's going to go Q2, Q1, Q3. Won't make sense. So I would use the star, but I know you guys like to follow your teachers who give you incorrect information. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about consumer and producer surplus. I'm just kidding. I know there's lots of good teachers out there. Okay, especially any teachers who need any teacher training programs. I need a little teaching training for economics, you know, call me. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about consumer and producer surplus for a moment, because I want you to understand what that is. And then if we understand that, we can start coloring our diagram. And who doesn't like coloring, right? You know, coloring's fun. Okay, so we've got consumer surplus, which I'm going to label in black like that. I'm going to bold it, scroll down. I'm going to put producer surplus, and I'm going to put total surplus. And guess what? Do we even know what these things mean? No. Okay. And so what do we mean by consumer surplus and producer surplus and total surplus? Well, we're talking about utility. Okay, we're talking about utility, which is what economists like to measure as happiness, right? It's gratification or satisfaction or it's pleasure or it's happiness. It's a util, it's some measure of happiness. Well, what we can do is we can actually show that on the graph. We can show that diagrammatically. Is that the right word? And let's just start with a concept. Start with the concept of consumer surplus. So what you got to do when you're thinking about consumer surplus is remember it's a bargain. It's the difference between what a consumer is willing to pay and what they have to pay, right? Let's say I'm a coca-cola addict, a coca-cola head, a Coke head. Let's say I really, really like Coca-Cola and I'm willing to pay, you know, $1,000 for this Coca-Cola. Well, guess what? It's only a few dollars. So I get thousands and thousands, well, not thousands, but hundreds of dollars of value just by the fact that I'm willing to pay so much and I don't have to pay it. It's like that bargain that I receive, and that, you know, is going to make me happy. Okay. Conversely, when we think about producer surplus, it's a difference between what the cost of production is or what the supply is and the market price that you actually get. So, you know, just imagine the utility that's generated from, you know, some poor kid in an Indonesian, you know, copper mine who's, you know, or aluminum, you know, plant, and he's putting together little recycled Coca-Cola cans, and he'll do it for 2 cents. Then it sells for $1. I mean, granted, he's probably not the one getting paid, but you can imagine he becomes entrepreneurial and he starts, you know, his own shop doing that. That difference between the cost of production and the actual price, that is the producer surplus. And if we put those all together, we get a measure of how much happiness is generated in a society by one simple sweet can of carbonated sugar syrup water. Okay, so now how can we show this on a graph? Let's go back. Okay, I'm going to try to label this. Okay, so hopefully this makes it really clear for you what we mean when we show this on a diagram. And I'm going to define it, and I can think through this definition. I don't need to memorize this, okay? But you know, you can look up if you feel like my definition is not perfect. You can look it up in an A-level or IB textbook and just memorize it and regurgitate it. But I can think. Okay, what does it mean? And consumer surplus is the economic welfare generated as shown. Yeah, is that perfect English? I don't know, but we'll go with it. As shown by the difference between what a consumer is willing to pay, that's represented by the demand curve, and what they actually have to pay, and that would be the price. Okay, so it's the difference between demand and the price. And so with that in mind, let's label it. And I'm going to take this little paint bucket over here. I'm going to click, you know, bright yellow or bright green, some bright color, hopefully, because, you know, if I click a dark color, you know, dark colors are just sad. We like bright colors. This is bright yellow behind me. Okay, I'm going to pick this bright green, and I'm going to just go right to where that triangle is. Huh, look at that. And I'm going to go and I'm going to I'm going to pluck A. I'm going to pick A, my letter A, and I'm going to label it consumer surplus. And that's it. Now, producer surplus, it's going to be the bottom triangle. Never call it the bottom triangle. Never call consumer surplus the top triangle. That's not what it is. It's not a shape. Okay. It's a concept. It has a meaning. And this is the economic welfare generated as shown by the difference between what a producer is willing to sell at, okay? That's going to be roughly equivalent to marginal cost, or we'll call it supply, and what they actually receive. And that's the price, okay? And we can label that difference between the supply curve and the price. We're going to label it with a bright yellow. Label is not the right word. We're going to paint it with a bright yellow. And then we're going to label it PS. And now total surplus, well, that's easy. That's consumer surplus plus producer surplus. Oh my gosh, I got it. You know, that's all it is. Consumer surplus, producer surplus, total surplus, economic welfare. How cool is that? Okay, so let's just take this in for a moment. And what I want to do is I want to also think about what happens when the government sticks its nose in here, okay? And let's say for a moment that this is the market for labor. Okay, and I'm spelling it L-A-B-O-R because you know what? George Washington won the Revolutionary War. Sorry, Queen. Oh, I shouldn't, maybe too soon. Okay, and I'm going to label this not P star, but I'm going to label it W star. What? W? That's not the first letter in the word price. Wage, okay? The price of labor is a wage. So we've got a demand for labor, right? And we can actually give this a little subscript. We're going to call it DL. Move that over. And then I'm going to label this SL. And then this is QL, quantity of labor. And then this is Q star L, right? So my equilibrium quantity. Maybe let's try moving that over here. Oh, that's not perfect. You know, it's an art, okay? It's a science, but it's also an art. I'm trying to get the stuff to look nice. And it's not perfect. I tell you. If I was doing this in Adobe Illustrator, anyway, let's take this with a thicker weight, right? Because the heavy hand of government's going to come in and they're going to say, you know what? W star is too low. We need to have a higher minimum wage so that we get elected because it looks like we're doing something good for society when in fact we're not really. So let's label this minimum wage, okay? Minimum wage causing minimum wage, okay? And I'm gonna, take my little line over here, maybe a thinner line this time. And I'm gonna note that the demand for labor and the supply for labor are going to diverge when we have this price, right? What do you mean diverge? Okay, well, let's just think of this for a second and know also that the demand for labor, what do you call the demand for labor? Those are employers. So those are the people who want to hire people. And what's the supply of labor? Well, those are workers. Okay, that's the proletariat. Okay, those are the people that are, the working man or working woman or working whoever. Working juror. Okay, and I'm going to label this line, or I'm going to drag down this line like so and drag down this line like so. Well, why? Because note that at the minimum wage, there's only a certain amount of demand. This demand, it's not there yet. You'd have to have a much lower wage in order for these employers to start hiring people because they're only willing to pay at a much lower rate. So I'm going to drag down this line. And now I've got my quantity of labor demanded. Oh, that's the quantity of labor that's actually demanded. Interesting. And now here, what I've got is what? Well, that's where the supply of labor is at a higher price. Of course, at a higher price, at a higher wage. Everybody wants to work for a higher wage. I'll work for a higher wage. Sure, boss. Quantity of labor supplied. Okay, interesting. Now, obviously, you'd want to have these kind of looking nice if you're going to hand this in to say your instructor, but whatever. Now we've got a quantity of labor demanded, a quantity of labor that would be at equilibrium in a private market with no government intervention, laissez-faire. And then we've got a quantity of labor supplied. Okay, now that's not the end of the story. What we can do is now analyze the surplus. And what I'm going to note is that there's a demand for labor, okay, and there's a supply for labor, and there's a demand for labor right here. There's a demand for labor where the wage is a little bit less than the minimum wage. And I could label that with a price, but it'll get the diagram a little messy. But let's say the minimum wage is now $15 an hour. There's somebody who's willing to pay $12 an hour, and there's somebody who's willing to work at $8 an hour. Well, those people don't trade anymore, so they don't negotiate a job anymore. So they're out of the market, and we're going to call that dead weight loss. So that little gray area, we're going to call that dead weight loss. Okay, very fancy term for economic welfare that is being lost. Okay, we'll just move that over here. And I'll just label it as lost economic welfare. Okay. And really that should be in bold, but I'm not perfect. Okay. And now that's not it. That's not the end of the story. There's one last thing that happens. Remember that the producer surplus is the difference between the price, or in this case, the wage, and the supply, or the minimum willingness to work. Okay. Or the minimum price that people would be willing to work at or produce at. Well, now the price has gone up, the wage has gone up. So these people here, these producers, they're getting even more of a benefit. So there are some people that really benefit from minimum wage. And then at the same time, though, those consumers, those employers, they get a little bit less because now they got to pay a higher wage, right? Maybe they're willing to pay you $100 an hour, but you negotiated only 15. And then maybe there is a case for the government to say, hey, you know what? Now it's got to be $20 an hour. I don't know. Is there really a case for the government to do that? No. But anyway, that's a secondary issue. Now, one last little thing I want to note, besides the fact that producer surplus increased, consumer surplus decreased, and there's been a total surplus loss, given the deadweight loss, I also want to notice this. Quantity of labor supplied is higher than the quantity of labor demanded. That difference, okay, that difference right here, that is called excess supply. Or sometimes it's called a surplus, but we don't really want to call it surplus because it gets confusing with all these other types of surplus. It's surplus in a different sense. And so we'll call it excess supply, but you know what you call the excess supply of labor when you've got more workers than there are people who want to hire? We're going to call this, in this context, the market for labor, unemployment. So this amount right here, this is the real wage unemployment that's generated from the government imposing minimum wage. Now, in the real world, is there that much economic welfare lost from a government imposing minimum wage? Well, we don't know how much, because you could have a really inelastic demand curve. Oh my gosh, what's inelasticity mean? It depends on basically the slope of your demand curve and the slope of your supply curve, and it depends on how high the minimum wage is in a particular industry compared to what the industry average is, and whether there'd be trades that would occur, and blah 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 blah. But yeah, basically there is some economic welfare lost from the imposition of a minimum wage, and from any price control, you're going to get either a surplus or a shortage. But who cares about that? I just want to show you how to draw it. Okay, that's it for now. Peace.